comparatively speaking, for the area, and B, you're surrounded by greedy neighbours who aren't as rich as you are.
To make matters worse, feuds began to erupt among the Britons' highly territorial regional rulers.
Warlords, we might call them, taking over parts of the country.
Barbarian hordes, long suppressed by the Roman presence, took advantage of this turmoil and rose up like a plague. Some came by sea.
You'd got the Irish. They came over and raided the western coast of Britain as pirates, basically.
Others came by land.
The Scots and the Picts, the painted people, come down from the north.
In a frantic effort to stem the barbarian tides, the Britons took a drastic step. They brought in some heavy muscle, Germanic mercenaries.
And so the story is that somewhere around 500, the native British invited in a body of Angles and Saxons to defend them against the Picts and the Scots.
For a while, the mercenaries did as they were told. But Britain was a wealthy, lush nation, and before long the Saxons decided they wanted the fertile green land for themselves. The Britons' gamble backfired.
They then reaped the reward of the risk they were taking when their own defenders turned on them and began to loot them and conquer them instead.
The Saxons swept across the land.
And before long, Britain was involved in a full-scale war against the Anglo-Saxons.
One by one, the great Roman cities fell to the swords of the invaders. It seemed that all was lost. But then, incredibly, near the end of the 5th century, the Saxon invasion appears to have been halted, and even reversed. Accounts differ, but some people claim that a single man, his true identity shrouded in mystery, was responsible for this turning of the tide. And many believe that this mysterious savior was the basis for the legend of King Arthur. But if this is true, then who was he? And where did he come from? Theories abound, but there are 3 candidates in particular whose biographies seem to fit the bill. Candidate number 1 was a brave and tragic man who, as the troops pulled out, valiantly stayed behind to defend his adopted people, the Roman. Candidate number 2 was a well-traveled man and a powerful leader, more than capable of welding together a fractured nation, the High King. And candidate number 3 ruled over the last British stronghold, the Big Bad Bear. Each of these 3 candidates is convincing in his own right, but which, if any of them, was the real King Arthur? Arthur's historical identity is a matter that's been debated by historians for centuries. While much of the potential evidence from the Dark Ages probably crumbled long ago, a few pieces do still remain. But there are a lot of gaps. The sum total of the evidence in favor of Arthur amounts to a few pages of poetry, some questionable graffiti, and a mysterious iron burial cross that bears a tantalizing message. Some, all, or none of this could be proof of a real historical Arthur. But on the other hand, perhaps we're looking in the wrong place, or rather, at the wrong time. Perhaps proof of King Arthur's existence is right in front of us.
My name is actually Arthur Uther Pendragon. I'm commonly known as King Arthur.
Arthur is a 21st century druid who claims to be the reincarnation of the original king. His role is to defend the island in a new time of need, fighting a new kind of battle.
All I know is when Britain needs them most, as the legend says, and Arthur will stand up, and that's how I view my job at the moment.
So can this 21st century Arthur help shed any light on the identity of the once and future king? Or is he just another part of the mystery? it's time to look more closely at the evidence and try to work out where the facts end and the fiction begins. In order to sift the fact from the fantasy, we need to follow the trail of clues back to the beginning. The earliest mention of Arthur is in a Dark Age poem about a band of tragic warriors.
It likens one of the warriors to a man called Arthur, and the man called Arthur seems to have been the King Arthur of legend.
But the name Arthur is only mentioned in passing.
All they simply do is to suggest that he historically existed.
And the poem wasn't actually penned until the Middle Ages, hundreds of years later.
In which case, this is just beefing up the poem in response to Arthur's new fame.
The first direct mention of King Arthur doesn't appear until roughly 300 years after he would have lived, in a book written by a monk, supposedly named Nennius.
Nennius, writing in the early 800s, tells us that Arthur was, and these are his words translated into English, leader of battle.
In this role, Arthur led the Britons in a string of 12 brutal clashes, ending in triumph at a bloodbath known as the Battle of Mount Badon. Here, Arthur reportedly slew 960 men himself. This victory allegedly sent the Saxons into retreat for 40 years, effectively stopping their invasion. But more importantly for us, it places King Arthur in a verifiable frame of reference.
Mount Badon certainly happened. It was a battle that's a part of real history.
Using other historical references, we can date the Battle of Mount Badon to the beginning of the 6th century. So we now know when Arthur might have lived, but that's about it. The legend as we know it didn't appear until the 15th century, in Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur. In this account, Arthur emerged as a fearless leader. The Knights of the Round Table were paragons of virtue, who embarked upon the ultimate quest, the search for the Holy Grail. The mighty Excalibur smote Arthur's mortal foes, while Merlin battled his magical ones. All seemed to be well in the idyllic castle of Camelot. And then, it all fell apart. Arthur was betrayed by his beautiful wife Guinevere when she and Arthur's most trusted knight Lancelot fell in love. Their adulterous affair shattered the Round Table. Arthur's enemies acted quickly, and the son of his greatest foe, the sorceress Morgana, seized the throne of Britain. Arthur was mortally wounded in battle. He travelled to Avalon, never to be seen again, and there the fairy tale ends. But where does history end and poetic license begin? The fact is, it's almost all fiction. For a start, there's the vision of a heavily armoured knight charging from a massive castle and wielding a menacing long sword. According to weapons expert Mark Griffin, this never happened.
Well, plate armour wasn't around for about another 1,000 years after King Arthur was probably around.
Instead, the state-of-the-art body armour worn by a 5th century king would have been a hand-me-down.
Stuff left over from the end of the Roman era. So we're looking at items like this leather padded armour.
This would simply have been augmented with a little crude chainmail. And that's not all. Massive stone castles also hadn't been invented yet.
Well, if there was a Camelot, it wouldn't have had big stone walls, it wouldn't have had towers with nice pointy roofs.
Instead, the home of the 5th century king would have been more like a wooden lodge, not quite so imposing. Still, at least Arthur had his trusty sword to protect him. Or did he?
King Arthur's sword was certainly not the medieval broadsword loved by modern retellings and films and TV, because this again, 15th century.
The sword of a 5th century king would probably have been shorter and without a crossguard, and it would have had symbolic value.
At the time, around about 500 AD, the kings of Britain were often signified not by a crown like a king of the medieval period would wear, but by the sword they had. The sword was the king's symbol of office.
The descriptions of how Arthur and company looked are obviously a bit inaccurate, but the embellishment hasn't stopped there. Dr. Richard Barber has been studying Dark Age and medieval literature and King Arthur since the 1950s, and he explains that the tale has had some flourishes added to it over the years.
The key thing about Arthur is because you start with very little except the idea of a heroic figure, you can write variations on it the whole time.
The variations echoed popular medieval themes like corrupted morals, holy relics, and black magic. But these juicy plot points weren't part of the original story.
Nobody who was alive during Arthur's lifetime actually writes about him. So you start with a rather large hole where there ought to be something.
But then something interesting happened. After centuries of invasion and war, life in Britain finally quietened down.
You're not in a society which is struggling to exist. There is a whole culture which builds up as a result. And into this come the romancers.
And it was these medieval storytellers who decided to give the King Arthur legend a little extra flair. A case in point is the quest for the Holy Grail. According to the legend, King Arthur sent his knights off in search of the Cup of Christ. This tale probably didn't interest the Britons of the 6th century, who were struggling just to survive. But 600 years later, with Christianity flourishing, the Grail theme would have struck a nerve.
There's an amazing amount of theology in the romances, which seems to us extraordinary. I mean, you don't put theology into popular novels, but you have to remember that this was central to people's lives, and that going to church was the most dramatic thing they would actually see.
And accordingly, the Arthur story was retrofitted with religious overtones to boost its appeal to a medieval audience. Historian Ronald Hutton thinks the same is true for the corrupted morals of characters like Lancelot and Guinevere.
And it appears in the troubadour society of the Middle Ages, in royal courts which want to have a slightly titillating and civilized account of the problems of people like themselves.
Dark Age audiences, on the other hand, probably had no interest in such antics. So if the soap opera and heavy metal aspects of the legend are fabrications, what about the pyrotechnics, the magic? Assuming there probably wasn't any more magic in the Dark Ages than there is today, we can quickly discount tales of enchanted stones and ladies lying in ponds. But if these stories aren't faithful accounts of real events, then what are they? We may also find clues as to the origins of these legends in the life of the time. Take the tale of the sword in the stone. Supposedly, the young Arthur pulled an enchanted blade from a block of stone, thereby confirming his right to be king of the Britons. This story may have had a basis in fact.
If you're going to put a reality behind these, you have to remember that you get swords from stones and you make them because they are forged by pouring molten metal into stone molds.
Then you removed the moulds and you had a sword which had come out of stone, quite literally.
There's an equally simple explanation for the story of the Lady of the Lake. Legend has it that early in his career, Arthur broke the sword he'd pulled from the stone, and that a magical water spirit, the Lady of the Lake, replaced it with the mythical blade Excalibur.
Now that sounds completely make-believe. However, what is interesting is, according to Roman writers, the Celtic people had a tradition that during a funeral rite, a king's prized possession, very often his sword, would be thrown into a sacred lake, river or stretch of water as an offering to a water goddess.
So it's likely that both the sword in the stone and the Lady of the Lake were fanciful reimaginings of relatively common Dark Age rituals. The supernatural powers of Merlin and his malicious antithesis Morgana also seem rather implausible. but there are similar likely explanations for them, although they're less rooted in reality than mythology. Merlin is probably based on a figure named Merlin, a wild man imported from Welsh folklore.
The original Merlin, if there was one, is a generation at least later than Arthur. He's a warrior who goes mad and acquires in his madness the powers of prophecy, which is a great story, but it's not anywhere near the Arthurian legend in time.
Morgana is probably derived from equally unconnected mythical roots.
There was an ancient Celtic goddess called the Morrigan. She was basically a goddess of witchcraft, if you like, and it could have been that the Morrigan somehow got woven into the King Arthur story and became the story of Morgan Le Fay or Morgana.
The magical aspects of the King Arthur story were probably lifted directly from popular folklore. So is there anything left to the legend that we can't explain away as a popular medieval add-on? Once we strip away the flashy embellishments, we get down to the very core of King Arthur, a hard-hitting Dark Age warrior. The evidence implies that he lived around 500 AD. He was a military leader who fought the historical Battle of Mount Badon and stopped a devastating invasion. But do these sketchy details describe any of our three candidates? We start with the Battle of Mount Badon. There are no eyewitness accounts that put anyone named Arthur at the scene, but there is one man whose story seems to revolve around the defeat of the Saxons. The tale is told in a book written in the 6th century. It describes a great leader who rallied the Britons and beat back the Saxons. His name is Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Roman. At least one ancient text credits him with the victory at Mount Badon, but beyond that we know nothing about him, at least nothing that relates to the Arthurian legend. But there's another Roman whose military exploits might have been mixed up with Aurelianus' story. Artorius Castus, Latin for Arthur, was a Roman officer stationed in Britain in the 2nd century. That makes him about 400 years too young to have been fighting the Saxons. But over the centuries, some very Arthur-like legends have come to be connected with Artorius. The reason for this is his association with a unit of cavalry soldiers known as Sarmatians. Dr. Linda A. Malcor, a specialist on Arthurian studies, sheds some light on the matter.
And they wore scale armor. They had long swords that they fought with from horseback, and they flew a Pendragon banner, a dragon-head banner, at the head of their units when they went into battle. And so they looked very, very much like medieval knights.
The Sarmatians are also known to have worshipped a sword stuck in the ground during some religious rites. Furthermore, Sarmatian legend tells of a fearsome warrior who wielded an unstoppable sword, with connections to a magical water ritual, which sounds a lot like Excalibur. The name, the look, and the sword all seem to point to King Arthur. There's just that inconvenient 400-year gap. But not everyone agrees that King Arthur was a Roman import. The grand old man of Arthurian lore, Geoffrey Ashe, began to study Arthur 50 years ago. And after decades of sifting through ancient evidence, he thinks he's got a pretty good idea of who Arthur was. He puts his money on a Dark Age ruler named Riotarmus. This High King is our second candidate, and he has some serious credentials.
He does quite a lot of the things Arthur is supposed to have done.
Historical documents prove that he was around at the right time. But for Ashe, the critical element is Riotarmus's famous expedition to what is now modern-day France. He went there on a rescue mission, helping one of the last Roman emperors to fight off a barbarian army.
He brought this king over from Britain with a fair-sized army across the Channel, and they fought against the Goths.
On the surface, this seems unimportant, but King Arthur supposedly did a fair bit of travelling abroad as well, and not just anywhere. Like Rio Thomas, he travelled to France. Rio Thomas's campaign ultimately ended in defeat, the result of a deadly betrayal. And much the same thing supposedly happened to King Arthur. According to legend, he left a knight named Mordred to guard Camelot. But Mordred was a double agent. He was the son of the sorceress Morgana. It was the traitorous Mordred who seized the throne and dealt Arthur his mortal wound. This injury forced Arthur to depart for the legendary Avalon. And here again there's an intersection between Arthur and Rio Thomas. Shortly after he was betrayed, Rio Thomas disappeared, and he was last sighted in an intriguing location.
When you have last glimpsed him historically, he is on his way into the area we call Burgundy. And in Burgundy, there is a real town called Avalon.
Is this Avalon perhaps the real-world inspiration for the mythical island? Rio Thomas's story bears a striking resemblance to the Arthur legend. The only piece that doesn't seem to fit is the name. No matter how you look at it, Rio Thomas just isn't Arthur. But Ash has an explanation for this.
He is recorded as Rio Thomas, which apparently is a title. It means what the Irish call the High King, the Supreme King.
If Rio Thomas was just his job description, is it possible that his name was Arthur? Could Rio Thomas have been the historical basis for the legendary king? It's possible, but surely the real King Arthur should be a homegrown hero who made his name fighting in England rather than France. Graham Phillips is inclined to agree, and he believes that you don't have to look across the sea to find proof of Arthur. It's all in the name. For that reason, he's placing his bets on a 5th century king who may have ruled over one of the last British-controlled cities of the time.
Now, during Roman times, the 4 most important cities in the country were London, Lincoln, York, and another one called Viraconium.
London, Lincoln, and York all fell to the barbarian onslaught, leaving Viraconium as the last city stronghold of the Britons.
The question is, who ruled from Viraconium?
Graham began to look through the genealogies.
And we know from these that the man who ruled from Viraconium around 500 AD was named Owen Thangwyn.
At first, this seemed to be a dead end. King Arthur and King Owen were surely not one and the same.
But what was interesting is many British warriors at this time adopted the names of animals that somehow represented their prowess in battle. There was the hound, the fox, and so. This man, Owen Thangwyn, seems to have been called the bear.
At first, the connection isn't obvious, but a quick analysis of modern Welsh descended from the ancient language of the Britons reveals a surprising coincidence. The Welsh word for bear is arth, and the Latin word is ursus. Together, they offer an intriguing clue.
And so you may have had a shortening of Arthursus, becoming Arthur.
Little remains of the city of Viraconium. But the bear may have a legend of a different kind. Legend refers to King Arthur as the once and future king, meaning he will one day reclaim the throne. That may just be another fanciful piece of the legend, but what if it's an important clue of the genealogical kind? Graham dug a little deeper.
But we're very lucky in the case of Owen Thangwyn, because we know from the genealogies he had a son.
That son's descendants eventually married into another prominent medieval family.
And their direct descendants were the Spencer family.
And the Spencers produced one of the most famous royals of recent memory, Princess Diana.
And of course, her son, William, is second in line to the British throne.
Which means that if the bear was the real King Arthur, Diana's son, Prince William, would be his direct descendant.
And the interesting thing is, his middle name is Arthur.
Roman, High King, or Bear? The theories about King Arthur's true identity are numerous, and each is convincing in its own right. But theories are nothing more until we've got some proof. Ancient documents can certainly be helpful. They can help lead us to solid evidence like a birthplace, a house, or a grave. As we've already seen, the existing historical documents don't tell us much.
I don't think they're going to give us more than we've got. Archaeology, however, is turning up more and more of what should be Arthur's people every year.
Archaeology may be our best hope of identifying Arthur, and perhaps the most obvious place to start is finding his castle. However, that's not as easy as it sounds. The most popular contender for the fabled stronghold of Camelot is Cadbury Castle. Unfortunately, it has no towers and no moat. In fact, today there's not a single stone in sight.
It's not a castle in the medieval sense. It is a hill fortified with earthworks.
But if we remember that Arthur's castle may in fact have been a wooden lodge, excavations conducted in the 1960s may have produced some tantalizing clues.
And the dig found that the fortifications had been renewed around Arthur's probable date, and there was a lot of post holes inside that might have been a feasting hall for just such a leader.
If Arthur did exist, he would have needed a fortress, and Cadbury appears to have been massively rebuilt at exactly the right time.
It is quite plausibly the real Camelot.
But there's a problem.
There's no actual link with Arthur himself whatsoever.
Nothing beyond a local tradition that only dates back to the 16th century. To make the Arthurian connection, we need to find something more concrete, something distinctive and unique, something perhaps like a certain famous table. And here we may be in luck. Not far from Cadbury are the famous remains of Winchester Castle. And hanging on a wall in the castle is a very large, very old, and very round table. It's a massive relic, hundreds of years old, with places for all of Arthur's knights. But unfortunately, it's not the round table. Radiocarbon dating tests performed in the 1970s showed that it was built in the 13th century, about 800 years too late. This too is just another legend. Then Camelot could have been anywhere. But if the whereabouts of Arthur's castle are a mystery, the location of his legendary birthplace is not. It's widely regarded to be beautiful Tintagel on the western coast of Cornwall. Unfortunately, like so many parts of the legend, Arthur's birthplace wasn't mentioned until 600 years after he would have lived.
And so it's easy to say this is a late story connected to a site that has nothing to do with him and does nothing to prove his existence.
Like Cadbury Castle, not much remains of the original structure. The spectacular ruins here only date from the 13th century. All that remains of the Dark Age structures are some grassy foundation stones. But although there's not a lot to go on, there may just be enough.
But here's the tingly thing. Recent archaeology has shown that Tintagel actually was a great royal site of exactly the Arthurian period.
Was it a place where a young king might have been born? During the excavations, archaeologists discovered a small piece of slate with the letters of a name faintly visible. A-R-T. Was this evidence of the existence of the young boy king? Unfortunately, Tintagel has yet to provide any more details. But what about the other end of the Arthurian lifeline? His grave. Legend says that the mortally wounded Arthur set sail for the Isle of Avalon, also known as the Place of Apples. He never returned. With medical intervention unlikely and magical resuscitation impossible, Arthur probably died there. So if we want to find his grave, the smart money is on Avalon. But modern Britain turns out to be conspicuously devoid of towns called Avalon. However, that may not always have been the case. A clue comes from the town of Glastonbury. The tower here is relatively young, but Glastonbury's history goes back much further.
It is very strange. It's in a cluster of hills, but it used to be called the Isle of Avalon.
There does seem to be one glaring problem, though. This Avalon is definitely not an island. However, archaeological evidence indicates that in the 5th century, Glastonbury would have been surrounded by lake and marsh for several kilometers. And even better, the area has been noted for centuries for its delicious red apples. It's an intriguing coincidence, but not exactly proof. But about 900 years ago, or so the story goes, definitive proof was finally unearthed. In 1191, the monks of Glastonbury got a hot tip that a certain famous king was buried in their graveyard. They grabbed their shovels and began to dig.
They went down quite a long way. They found a rather crude sort of coffin made out of a hollowed-out log.
Inside were 2 skeletons, a fair-haired maiden and a large man bearing traces of a mortal head wound. And best of all, they found a marker in the form of a cross.
In case anybody doubted it, the monks claimed to have found, lying upon the coffin, a lead cross carved with an inscription.
Here lies the body of the famous King Arthur, buried at Avalon. Tangible proof of Arthur's existence had finally been found. The search for the legendary king was over. Or was it? When it comes to hard proof for the existence of King Arthur, the Glastonbury story might not be all that it's cracked up to be. The discovery of the tomb was carefully documented, and a number of tracings of the marker cross were made. But all the physical evidence, the bones, the coffin, and the original cross has been lost. All we have to go on now are the tracings of the cross made before it disappeared. And there's no way to be sure that they're even accurate. But assuming they are, can the text tell us anything? The script is an old form of Latin, as we'd expect to find on Arthur's grave marker. That doesn't tell us much, but it does give us a chance to date the inscription. The shapes of the letters in the alphabet we use today have been evolving for thousands of years. So if we can identify which letter forms were used, we might be able to identify the period in history in which the inscription was created. Sadly, the N's and C's on the cross were written in a style not used until long after Arthur's supposed time. This means the cross couldn't have been created in the 6th century, and so it was almost certainly a forgery. But why would the 11th century holy men have wanted to fake Arthur's grave? Records at the Abbey reveal a possible motive.
Glastonbury was the richest and most important abbey in the whole of England, the favourite abbey of the native English kings. And it runs into trouble in the 12th century. The abbey burns to the ground by accident.
The monks needed to rebuild, or they risked losing their place as a preeminent abbey.
They needed money in a hurry, and the king wasn't too interested.
What they needed was the kind of money that pilgrims to a famous grave might donate. So the monks began to dig.
So they claim to find the body of Arthur there. The monks get their money, they get their tourists, Glastonbury prospers.
With the bones gone and the cross almost certainly a hoax, the whole idea of Arthur's grave starts to sound pretty empty. The Tintagel slate doesn't involve any conspiracy, and the writing there does date to around the 6th century. But sadly, it too is wanting.
The Tintagel slate is very, very interesting and a wonderful find, but that doesn't deliver us a historical Arthur.
The translation of the name on the slate is pronounced Arthnu. And while there are obvious similarities, that's not the same as Arthur. So unless we've been calling King Arthur by the wrong name for 1500 years, the slate is talking about someone else. Hard proof of the legendary king seems to be as ephemeral as the mists that blanket his country. Without written proof or archaeological evidence, we're left with only what we can glean from the records of our 3 candidates. And yet here too we come up short. While it's possible that Riotarmus was the mythical king, some historians take exception to the loose translation of his title.
But it was a name. You don't have to translate it into a phrase. It was a guy's name.
The rest of the case is also disputed. Riotarmus was known for fighting barbarians alongside the Roman army, but Arthur wasn't.
It's a curious choice. Who was British and who was doing some military deed, who could be seized upon and turned into Arthur. I mean, it's fantasy.
In fact, it's unclear that Riotarmus was even from Britain. Some people think that it's likely he was in France not because he was on a campaign, but because he lived there.
Which, given the fact that he's going all the way to central France, in some ways seems more likely. So it's a lovely possibility, but we're not much closer to certainty.
And if Riotarmus and King Arthur were the same man, why is there no explicit historical connection? The answer is probably that Riotarmus wasn't Arthur after all. And nor was our Roman. We've already established that Artorius Castus, the leader of the Sarmatian cavalry group, lived 400 years too early. But sadly, our other Roman candidate, Ambrosius Aurelianus, was probably also too ancient. Ambrosius was probably in his prime in the early part of the 5th century, which means that by the time of the Battle of Mount Badon at the beginning of the 6th century, he would have been in his 70s at least. The average lifespan in the Dark Ages was around 35, 40 at most, so it's highly unlikely that Aurelianus was alive at Mount Badon, much less a famed warrior champion. If there was a real King Arthur, it seems that he wasn't a Roman. Which leaves us only with King Owen, the bear. But unfortunately, there's not much evidence to support this claim either. He was in the right place at the right time, with what seems to have been the right name. But it turns out that there's no hard evidence that it actually was his name. The bear was the moniker of a Dark Age king, but it was Owen's son. There's no historical evidence that the father shared the nickname. And that means there's no reason to think that Owen was the historical Arthur. Prince William may have to settle for being a regular Prince of Wales. So what can we deduce? Was King Arthur real? Or was he perhaps a composite of famous kings created by poets and troubadours in the Middle Ages? In the end, there's no paper trail to document his life, and no physical evidence that he even existed at all.
Although there's been a huge amount of argument over this, unless we come up with some dramatic archaeological discovery, we're never going to be able to unpack it.
It's not impossible, but if somebody comes without new information and says, you know, I've had a vision of the historical Arthur, well, it's just that. It's a hallucination.
We may have to accept the fact that we'll never find his mythical castle or his legendary grail. But then again, there's always a chance that the once and future king will indeed return.